We are live.
We are live.
Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Nice. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Nice to see some familiar names. Hi, Donna. Hi, Terry. Hi, Serena. Nice. For those of you who are joining us, if you wanted to get some conversation started, maybe you could enter into the chat where you're joining us from, or maybe what you'd like to learn from this evening. I see a few people with their hands raised in the bottom of the Zoom chat bar. Actually, at this time, we're not going to allow folks to talk, but if you have anything to say, please feel free to enter that in the chat, and we'll be sure to address what you have to say live.
I can't see because I'm already screen sharing, but are we sure that the chat is enabled? It looks like a bunch of stuff. Oh yeah, chat function is disabled.
Oh no, here we go again. This is this weird Zoom feature. Connor and I troubleshooted this last time around. Oh, Serena is on it. Okay, thank you everybody for raising your hand and bringing that to our attention. Such an interesting time we're in at this moment. All right. Well, again, thank you all so much for joining us. We'll be getting started in just a minute, giving some folks a little bit of time to enter this webinar. We've got Sarita and Connor troubleshooting things in the background in order to get our chat enabled. Thank you so much for your patience here. I think this is the life of having everything on Zoom now. There's bound to be errors and technical difficulties. It's working. Woohoo! All right, thanks team for handling that. Just, it's not a fun webinar without a moment of panic in the beginning.
And just to respond to a question in the Q&A, the recording will be viewable at a later time. So you will be able to share it with your husband, yes. Great. We're going to do a follow-up email in the days following the webinar with some resources, as well as the link to the recording of the webinar.
Great. For those of you who are just joining us, we're encouraging people to input something into the chat, maybe where you're joining us from today or something that you'd be interested in learning in tonight's webinar. And in just a moment, we'll go ahead and get started, but again, giving some time for some folks to be joining us.
Seems like we've got a lot of Sonoma County locals, which is awesome. Seeing Windsor, Santa Rosa, Sebastopol, Cotati, Roanoke Park. I'm in Forestville. We got any other Forestvilleans out there?
I'm Petaluma. Any Petaluma folks? Oh, we've got somebody from Coffee Park. Looking for ideas for transforming, oh no, so much chat. Transforming my dirt/weed forest in my backyard. I'm sure there are going to be many folks battling the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll for folks just to kind of get a sense of where we all are at today, how we're feeling, and then again, are you planning on transforming your landscape? So for those of you who are on the computer, a poll is going to be popping up on your screen. It's completely anonymous, but again, this is just kind of like a little icebreaker that we can do via the computer. It's always fun to see people submit their answers as well. All right, good responses. For those of you who may not be on the computer and seeing this in live time and might be joining us through the telephone, the polls right now, the first question is, what is your internal weather today? So we ask folks, are you feeling stormy, overcast, cloudy with a chance of sun, or bright and sunny? Our second question is, are you planning on transforming your landscape? Maybe, yes, definitely yes. I'm gonna go ahead and end this polling. And I'm gonna share the results with you all. Seems like we have an overwhelming amount of folks who are feeling bright and sunny. And we've got folks who are absolutely looking to transform their landscapes. A few maybes in there, but maybe after this, you'll have that confidence and the know-how in order to move forward. Loving the chats, everybody. And yes, sheet mulch does look fantastic. I'm gonna go ahead and just kick things off with a warm welcome to everybody here tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening for How to Transform Your Landscape. We absolutely appreciate that you've taken the time to join us this evening. And tonight's webinar is brought to you by a collaboration between Daily Acts organization and the Town of Windsor. So I do want to give a really big thank you to all of our partners who allow our events to be possible. Tonight's presentation is going to be hosted by myself, Liz, a senior programs coordinator with Daily Acts, and my two fantastic colleagues. We have programs coordinator Serena.
Hi everyone, my name's Serena and I'm a programs coordinator at Daily Acts. Really excited to be with you guys tonight.
And Connor.
Hey everyone, my name is Connor. I'm also a programs coordinator with Daily Acts, and I'm grateful that you're taking time out of your Thursday night to be here with us.
Absolutely, thanks folks. And before we get started, I do imagine that there are some folks joining us this evening who may not have ever even heard about Daily Acts before. So I do want to take a moment to talk a little bit about our work and what we do. So Daily Acts is a holistic education nonprofit that takes a heart-centered approach to inspiring transformative actions that create connected, equitable, and climate-resilient communities. We believe in the power of our daily actions to reconnect people to self, community, and place, which helps to heal our society and our planet. Through over about 100 talks, tours, and trainings, every year we are implementing 3 interwoven strategies for systems change. First, we're spreading solutions and models that offer skills, tools, and resources to grow food, medicine, habitat, and community while conserving resources. Next, we're strengthening community leadership by connecting social justice issues through networks and alliances. And lastly, we are working to build public and political will by mobilizing our community's power for environmental and climate justice policies. Over the years, our reach has been far and wide, and to the core of our work is the belief that we each can be the change that we wish to see in the world. So again, and I can't say it enough, thank you all so much for being here tonight, and I certainly hope that you're able to learn something new that you can then share with others.
Okay, everybody. Before we really get started today, we just wanted to go over a little bit of Zoom etiquette with you guys in case, I'm sure most of you guys at this point have attended a webinar at some point, but just in case you haven't, If you do have a question, make sure you use the question and answer box. This is going to help us track your questions and make sure no questions go left unanswered. We are going to take some time to answer questions in between transitions of subjects, but don't worry. If your question doesn't get answered then, we'll definitely have time at the end to answer your question. Also, if you see somebody you know on the participant list, or if you want to say hi to somebody, or if you have an awesome idea you want to share, make sure you use the chat box. And when you're using that chat box, make sure you have it set to all panelists and everyone so everyone can see your messages and not just the three of us. So for tonight's agenda, first we're going to take some time. Liz is going to explain to you guys how to do site preparation and sheet mulching. Then Connor's going to take some time to explain water-wise plant selection and planting into that sheet mulch. I'm going to explain some irrigation tech to you guys, how to convert your irrigation from sprinklers to drip. And then we have some time left at the end to answer your guys' questions. Before we get started today, we wanted to show you guys this little meme that the programs team just really loves. And it says, "Are you still dressed like this?" It shows a man in the 1800s, proudly wearing his 1800s gear. It says, "Then why does your yard still look like this?" And in the tiny little text at the bottom, it says, "18th century style yards are no longer environmentally sustainable. It's time to adjust the aesthetics of our yards." And we really couldn't agree more. So we're excited that you guys are here tonight wanting to change the aesthetic of your yard as well. Now Liz is gonna get us started with sheet mulching.
Awesome. Thank you, Serena. And yes, that meme is absolutely fantastic. All right. So sheet mulching. Sheet mulching is going to be one of the first steps that we suggest when transforming your landscape. Whether you have a barren landscape, lawn, or an area completely taken over by weeds, sheet mulching is a really great way to get things started. Sheet mulching is sometimes known as lasagna gardening. And essentially it is a method that's going to allow you to build up your soil health, decompose your lawn or weeds in place, recycle materials, all while keeping water on your site and therefore reducing your contributions to stormwater runoff. For those of you who may not know, stormwater runoff is the water that comes off of a landscape, picks up any sort of debris along the way, and then gets funneled towards our storm drains and ultimately into the creeks. So sheet mulching is a really great way to keep water and resources on your site and out of the storm drain. So why sheet mulching? Why do we encourage the sheet mulching? And just before we dive into this, I do want to apologize that maybe some of the photos look a little bit grainy, but I think you can get the picture here. We have a weed landscape and then a beautiful sheet mulched landscape on the right-hand side. So why sheet mulching? Well, one of the aspects to having a really successful garden is going to be to have healthy soil. As you sheet mulch your landscape, you're going to be passively composting your site in place. As you add compost, you're adding nitrogen. As you add mulch, you're adding carbon. So the combination of these nutrients and the decomposition that is occurring is going to be increasing your biodiversity, as well as increasing the organisms, as well as the access to these resources for your plants and all of the life and health in your soil. Another really great benefit that we highly advocate for during sheet mulching is its ability to suppress weeds. So the weed suppression actually comes from applying the cardboard and essentially suffocating out the weeds, because without any sunlight and without any water, the plants are not able to photosynthesize, and therefore they're not able to grow any further. In some instances, you're probably going to be encountering sites where there are heavy weeds, heavy weed pressure. And so for instances such as that, we typically encourage that folks are either using extra layers of cardboard, or you're waiting a few months before you actually plant into your sheet mulch zone in order to ensure that those weeds have had little to no sunlight or oxygen and ultimately end up being suffocated out. So on the topic of weeds, because I know we all have them in some way, shape, or form, I do want to mention a very common weed that we often see in landscapes, and that's going to be the weed Bermuda grass. So Bermuda grass, for those of you who don't know, it's pictured on the left-hand side. This is one of the most resilient and ferocious weeds in a landscape, at least in my opinion, primarily because it does grow rhizominously. As you can see on the left, you have the roots of this weed, and they're growing down and they're spreading out and they're spreading like crazy. One of the big issues with Bermuda grass is it will outcompete other plants. So it's going to, again, spread rapidly, and it's going to absorb all of the nutrients that the plants that you actually want to receive them. It's going to take it right away from them. Ultimately, again, outcompeting some of these plants and ultimately taking over an entire landscape. Some of you may know for certain that you have Bermuda grass, but there are probably a fair amount of us that actually do not. And so I do want to emphasize the importance of observing your site before you begin a transformation and acknowledging certain factors such as weed pressure. Another thing to mention specifically with Bermuda grass, but also with other weeds that are just as resilient as Bermuda grass, is that these weeds do typically go dormant in the fall or the winter. So it's not as obvious if you have these weeds. So what I would say at this time during the spring is take a look at your landscape in order to better determine what might be going on. And site observation, for one, is an incredibly important step when it comes to transforming your space. We could probably very easily spend an entire webinar advocating for different things to observe when you're beginning a landscape transformation, but luckily enough, we actually have done a previous webinar all about garden design, and I think that would probably be a really great resource for you all, and so we're happy to share that in a follow-up email. But very big emphasis on observing your site before you get started. And so back to Bermuda grass. I'm sure you're probably thinking, well, now what do? I might have Bermuda grass, or I have a really hardy weed in my landscape. So one of the methods that we will suggest in order to combat dense weeds such as Bermuda grass is going to be this process called solarization. Essentially, solarization is another method of suffocating weeds out, but it also is burning the weeds, the weed seeds, and their roots. And you do this and complete this transformation or this technique by laying a layer of UV treated plastic all across your landscape. So we're going to get into how to solarize very briefly. So how to solarize? Well, one of the things that I do want to mention, it's really important during the solarization process, is it's going to work best if it is done during the hottest times of the year. The combination of extreme heat on the plastic is going to create steam, and it's going to ultimately create the pressure that is needed in order to kill those really, really hardy weeds. So one of those first steps to solarization is going to be to clear your space to the best of your ability. Maybe you have lawn and weeds interspersed, or maybe you have very tall weeds. You can either mow everything down or hack everything down. I'd probably say remove it from the landscape, but it's okay if you leave it there, especially if it's not a lot. But clear your landscape and certainly do not leave anything or any plants that you'd like to preserve on site. Next, what we'd suggest is that you give your landscape a very deep water before you lay the plastic down. What this is going to do is it's going to help to produce the steam, which is ultimately what is going to kill those weed seeds. Next, you're going to want to cover your entire landscape with a thick piece of plastic. Typically, I would suggest a 6mm plastic. And again, getting something that is UV treated is going to be your best bet to really just ensure that it's actually going to hold up throughout these hot months and throughout that consistent sun exposure. So burying your edges is an incredibly important step throughout the solarization process. What I mean by that is you have your plastic all the way to the edge of your landscape, and you're going to want to put something heavy on each edge so that during a gust of wind, it's not flying up, basically so you can maintain all of that heat underneath that plastic to really eliminate those weeds. I would probably suggest in order to bury your edges that you use something such as sandbags or something heavy. Basically, you want to avoid puncturing that plastic. So just for example, if you were to put down like a garden stake on the edge, that would ultimately be causing a hole in your plastic and therefore creating an avenue for weeds to come through, because trust me, these weeds are resilient and they will find any avenue to come through and take over. Just very briefly, in the previous picture, if you were looking at it in great detail, the school that we did that solarization at did use leftover carpet that they had in order to hold down those edges. I don't know if this actually affected the amount of heat that was produced, but in combination with a few other strategies, their solarization process was successful. So there are a few different techniques that you can put into place. And then one of the very most important methods here, or important things to consider, is that you're leaving this in place during the hottest months of the year, and ideally leaving it for about 4 weeks. You really, really want to be sure that everything under that plastic is kaputs and done for. And then lastly, one of the final steps, and this is going to be a little bit dependent on the size of your site as well as the access to tools that you have. But one of the final steps is going to be to actually scrape your landscape and remove the material that has just been solarized. So this could look like potentially using a machine, a backhoe, and actually scraping and excavating that material out. Or on a smaller size site, it could even mean just using any sort of shovel to scrape and remove that material that you have just solarized. Typically, we would say that you would want to remove about 3 to 6 inches, so that first layer of soil and dirt. I know that sounds like a lot, and so in some instances the machinery is quite helpful, but even just to remove the surface level is going to be helpful. It's going to just be an added benefit to removing that material that could ultimately maybe reseed itself if for some reason it didn't work all the way. And then lastly, with anything really is going to be the need for maintenance. Solarizing is not a foolproof method. It does work, but again, with anything, maintenance is incredibly important, and trust me, with time, it's going to allow you to greatly reduce your weed pressure on your site. There are also a number of different organic and plant-friendly solutions to weed control. Many people say a combination of vinegar, dish soap, and Epsom salt can do the trick, and water. That is something that we can talk about later on, but maintenance, maintenance, maintenance. Really quickly, for folks who are in Sonoma County, Harmony Farm Supply is an excellent distributor for the 6mm UV grade plastic that you need. I believe most hardware stores probably would carry it as well, but with a little bit of research, you can get exactly what you want for the exact size that you want. Alrighty, so now preparation for actually beginning to sheet mulch your site. Solarizing is just one of those preparation steps before you're able to get started. So as you actually get ready to sheet mulch, you're going to want to be sure that your current landscape, whether it's weeds or lawn, again, that it gets mowed down or cleared as short as possible. It's completely fine to leave whatever clippings you have on site because you are going to be sheet mulching over it and it's ultimately going to be decomposing in place. Step 2, if you're going to be planting and installing drip irrigation on your site, you're going to want to cap and convert your sprinkler heads. Serena is going to go into much more detail about this later on. And then lastly, you're going to want to edge the perimeter of your site along all hardscapes in order to help prevent weeds from coming through that edge, but also it's allowing you to create a space that your cardboard is able just to roll right into. And so on this next slide, I've taken a stab at creating this diagram, and hopefully it's helpful, or hopefully it does a decent job at describing this edging process. Again, you're going to essentially want to be creating a divot for your cardboard to be placed into. And once your cardboard goes in and hits that pavement or that hardscape, just like this, you're also not allowing for an avenue for weeds to come through. For the material that you do dig out from this edge, you can either just distribute it all throughout your landscape and walk on it to flatten it, or you can get a little bit creative in it. You can actually reuse that material to create intentional topography throughout your landscape, maybe berms around a rain garden or something like that. For lawn, I have heard many people suggest as you are excavating it and creating that edge, if you flip it back onto your landscape, make sure that you have the roots actually sticking up so that they are less likely to reseed and spread throughout. Yeah, I hope that that diagram helps you picture what the edge process looks like. It can be a little bit hard to wrap your head around. Alrighty, so what are you going to need in order to successfully sheet mulch? So this is just a very quick overview of some tools that I find really helpful. My personal preference, and we do a lot of mulch moving. My personal preference when doing that mulch moving is actually to be using a pitchfork, and I really recommend and prefer a pitchfork with less tines, primarily because as you are moving that mulch, and we typically have medium-sized bark bits, but with more tines, it's more clogging and it just becomes a real pain. So less tines in your pitchfork is my personal preference. And then as you get down to the end of your pile, a snow shovel and a broom will become your best friend for getting all of those remaining bits. And the rest of the things here are just kind of suggestions for what I think make it easier. And I just want to do a quick plug because we have used them in the past, but the Santa Rosa Tool Lending Library is an amazing resource to find any and all of these tools. And more often than not, I've noticed a number of different cities adopting tool lending libraries. I've actually also seen a few hardware stores lending out some tools. So you can get creative if you don't have access to these things in your garage or your shed. There are a number of different resources to empower you to get your sheet mulching done. Alrighty, so now what we've all been waiting for, you've done the legwork, you've done your site prep, now you're ready to sheet mulch. So sheet mulching is actually a really straightforward process. We like to say it's a 1, 2, 3 process. So your first step is going to be spreading 1 inch of compost all throughout your landscape or in the areas that you're going to wish to plant. The next step is going to be layering 2 layers of cardboard throughout your site and really being sure that you are overlapping each piece of cardboard by at least 6 inches. This will help as an added measure for that weed suppression and not giving any sort of avenue for weeds to come through. And then finally, of course, you are then spreading your 3 inches of mulch all throughout your landscape. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have heavy weeds, I would definitely suggest applying more cardboard and more mulch to those zones as it will help to suppress them. All right, I just wanted to share a few photos of some of our sheet mulching projects. As you can see here, this is one of the first steps. We're spreading compost all throughout our landscape. It might be a little bit hard to see, but on the very bottom of this photo, you can kind of see that edge that I was mentioning earlier. And I actually didn't say it in the previous slide, but when you are creating this edge, you want to make sure that it is a very gradual slope into your pavement, a gradual slope, again, so that the cardboard can just roll right in there. If you had a very firm, like 90-degree angle, just imagine your cardboard going into the edge and having to completely bend, and that's an avenue for maybe the cardboard to rip, to tear, ultimately weeds coming through. And again, do want to reiterate, you only really need to be spreading cardboard in the areas that you wish to plant. And you can absolutely be using this sheet mulching process and technique solely for weed suppression. If that's the case, then you probably would not be spreading cardboard, or excuse me, you would not be spreading compost. Alrighty, so as we are spreading our cardboard, I guarantee that there are going to be cases where you're sheet mulching at a site and there are existing features on that site, from trees, shrubs, or utility boxes. You can absolutely sheet mulch around all of these things as seen in the tree photo there. But the biggest things you want to be sure is as you are sheet mulching, you're sheet mulching around these objects, you are either cutting your cardboard as you go along, or you're flagging these different features and cutting that cardboard out after this process is through. But when you are sheet mulching around plants, please be sure that you are not putting that material right up to the plant. And for example, for certain trees, you're able to see some exposed roots. You're going to want to leave that clear of any cardboard or mulch as well. This is because the combination of mulch and cardboard is going to be holding in a lot of moisture, and therefore excess moisture on roots, it can ultimately lead to root rot. So just be really mindful of things that you are sheet mulching around, especially if they are living. And then again, I do want to reiterate the importance of overlapping the cardboard during this process. You can see in some of these photos that the cart that were right there, nice Connor, thank you. You can see that 6 inches of overlap right there. What you can also see is as we're rolling out our cardboard, we're putting mulch right on top of it. You will learn pretty quickly that even the smallest gust of wind will take your cardboard and fly it to the neighbor's house. So as you are laying your cardboard bits out, I would suggest one of 2 things. One, either staging piles of mulch all throughout to hold that cardboard down while also maintaining 6 inches so that you can overlap your cardboard. Or another thing that you could do is actually spray your cardboard down as you go with water. I've seen a number of people that do this in different scenarios. One thing that I would mention with that technique is to be really mindful as you're walking throughout or as you're wheelbarrowing throughout your landscape to really reduce the amount of puncture holes that you put in your cardboard. As you're watering the cardboard, it does become a little bit more delicate, and so it's much easier to puncture. So just be really mindful to try not to create many holes, because if I haven't said it enough, that will be creating an avenue for weeds to come through. And then lastly, in this lovely sheet mulching process, you're going to be spreading your 3 inches of mulch all throughout that landscape, in that edge, around those rocks, not up against the tree, but in all of those areas. And like I mentioned in the very beginning, this sheet mulching process is a really fantastic way to keep that moisture on your site, reduce stormwater runoff. Ideally, it is less maintenance, and in my personal opinion, it actually creates a really nice, clean, landscaped look. Depending on what type of material you use, or like your sun exposure, how often you're watering, you are going to need to replenish the mulch on your site. But the timeline for that can really vary from like maybe every year to every 3 years. It really just depends on your usage of your site and your aesthetic preferences. So that was the sheet mulching process. It really, really is very straightforward. I quickly want to go over where we source some of our materials and a few things that we suggest and don't advise. So for most, if not all, of our Daily Acts programs, we are sourcing things in bulk. And we typically source in bulk from grab and grow soil products, but there are a number of different retailers wherever you are. And I will advocate that if you are doing like a full front yard or backyard, or even a full business landscape transformation, it's typically a lot cheaper to buy in bulk. Whether you're going to get a delivery from one of their trucks, your average truck bed can fit about 1 yard to 1.5 yards of this material, but buying in bulk typically, I'll advocate, is the way to go. And then for your compost, your mulch, and your cardboard, we are all about reusing of materials. So for compost from Grab and Grow, we're typically sourcing the clean green or any sort of organic blend. So I would really advocate for that. For arbor mulch at Grab and Grow, we're sourcing, when we're sourcing mulch, we're sourcing arbor mulch, which is typically a combination of pine, alder, fir, redwood, or acacia trees. And then for the cardboard, Grab and Grow has this really great opportunity to buy these cardboard rolls, which makes it really, really easy just to roll right onto your landscape. They come in 3-foot, 4-foot, 6-foot rolls, 6-foot tall rolls, and 250 feet in length. So they'll get the job done, and they're incredibly efficient. Now, a few things that I want to briefly mention that we suggest you avoid. The first thing is going to be gorilla hair mulch. This is the kind of fluffy, tough looking fibrous redwood mulch. The main reason that we don't advocate for this mulch is that it is highly flammable compared to other mulches. Other mulches tend to hold in a lot more moisture than this mulch, and so we just don't recommend it. Next, we don't recommend dyed mulch, and that is, of course, because whatever they are using to actually dye this mulch, typically, if not always, is going to be some sort of chemical. And so as that mulch attempts to break down, it's going to then be leaching chemicals into your soil. So that's certainly something that you want to avoid. And then lastly, weed fabric. Weed fabric is something that we come across relatively often when we're brought onto a project where maybe somebody else has done the landscaping in the past, or even just working with some homeowners. It's not a great solution. It doesn't really break down, and it's just a pain to have to go to adopt a site and come back and try to rip it out or remove it. And the biggest concern with the weed fabric is that as it attempts to break down, it's actually just kind of crumbling into smaller bits of debris, small plastics, and coming back to stormwater pollution. As it attempts to break down in the smallest rainstorm, that rain is going to pick those small plastics up and take it right into the storm drain. So we want to really avoid weed fabric as often as we can. And then to wrap things up, there are so many different ways that you can sheet mulch and get really creative and resourceful, which I find utterly enjoyable. So the first thing is going to be where we are using cardboard rolls. You could really use any sort of cardboard box. You could even be using newspaper. One really cool thing actually about using cardboard boxes, as you can see in that photo, it makes it a lot easier to sheet mulch and place your cardboard around existing features on your landscape. When you are using maybe recycled cardboard, you do want to be sure that you are removing any sort of tape on that cardboard, and you do want to avoid red dye. Red dye has some very toxic chemicals that you really wouldn't want to be leaching out into your landscape. Truly, the less ink, the better. Another thing would be to avoid any sort of waxy cardboard bits. That's just not going to break down at all. A lot of cardboard probably has some staples in it, so go ahead and try to remove those staples to the best of your ability. If you leave a few, it's no sweat. They'll just add a little bit of iron into your landscape. Yep, that's that, cardboard boxes. And then manure. Manure is a fantastic resource to find here in Sonoma County, typically horse manure. I see it for free all of the time. It's an excellent replacement for that compost, but again, I do want to advocate for organic. Talking to your source, making sure you know what they are feeding their horses and that you feel comfortable putting that material back onto your site. And then very similar with wood chips from a local chipping company. Basically all chipping companies, tree chipping companies, they're always looking for places to drop off their wood chips. The caveat with sourcing from a local chipping company is that you do need to be able to take on a good amount of wood chips, from 10 to even 20 yards of material. The one thing I do want to mention again with the wood chip company is checking your source, knowing what type of trees that they are chipping, but also it's a combination of knowing your soil, knowing what you need more of and knowing what you certainly don't need more of. With each sort of tree, it's going to add different nutrients into your soil. So it's a fantastic resource, but you do need to do a little bit of research ahead of time. And I think for now, that's probably going to be all for the sheet mulching process, but I'll open it up to the audience to see if there are any specific questions or any clarifying points that you have for sheet mulching.
We have one question from Judith. It asks if you should use grocery bags instead of newspaper.
Oh, cool. That's a fantastic idea, Judith. I think that would work really well. One thing that comes to mind is with the grocery bags, they're much thinner. I mean, newspaper is thin as well, but for that thin material, I would certainly advocate for using probably more than 2 layers. Essentially, you want to get kind of 2 inches of that cardboard material, but absolutely grocery bags would be a fantastic solution.
Another question just popped up is asking how many layers of newspaper should someone use?
You know, I think it's kind of a case-by-case situation. I don't have a good concept of, man, when I see a newspaper, I would almost say like the full stack. Just put, if you are collecting newspaper, I would say the full stack. But again, you do want to be careful that maybe you're going through that newspaper and making sure you're taking out any sort of waxy advertisements, or potentially the comics are very ink heavy. So just being really mindful of the ink that you are using or that might be on that newspaper.
Another question just came up and it's saying, is the cardboard necessary? I have a good sized area in the backyard and I want to attract pollinators. I have no plants there yet and it's currently covered in arbor mulch.
So the cardboard is necessary if you have weeds, for sure. Again, it's going to suppress those weeds and hold it all down. I don't know if you have a good sense of what was on your landscape prior to the arbor mulch that you already have. But if you know, that's kind of a tricky one. I would not suggest sheet mulching over your existing arbor mulch, mainly because if you had arbor mulch and then you put cardboard and more arbor mulch, when you cut into that sheet mulch zone, you're then going to be planting into more mulch. So if underneath your current arbor mulch is soil or something healthy other than weeds, then I would just plant right into your landscape. And way to go, plant in pollinators.
And then we'll take this one last question before we go on to the next section, but is it bad to add mulch right near your wood house? Do you worry about termites or fire safety?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And fire safer practices always come up. And I'm really glad that you bring this point because more and more we are learning about fire safer practices. I can't speak too much about the termite situation, but what I would suggest is that you keep at least a 5 feet around your home of defensible space. So I would not suggest to you that you put mulch right up to your home. At the very least, I would keep 5 feet. A lot of people, and I could get into fire safer practices, but I'll try and keep this brief and we can certainly chat afterwards or chat offline about this. But a lot of people have concerns about mulch being more flammable. Like I mentioned earlier, it's that gorilla hair mulch that is going to be the most flammable, but ultimately with a combination of maintenance of your plants, maintenance of everything around your landscape from the trees to the gutters, in combination with your water usage, that mulch and whatever you're planting, Ideally, it's pollinators or native plants. But that mulch is going to help keep that moisture on your site, and it's going to do a great job at doing that. So in many instances, and this is primarily because I'm coming from more of a native gardening standpoint, I wouldn't be advocating for rocking your entire landscape there. That's a very resource intensive process, but it's probably potentially, some people would argue, the most fire safer way to go. But I do want to really hit home that this mulch is going to keep moisture on your site. All right, thank you.
All right, thanks, Liz. So now I have the pleasure of talking to y'all about plant selection, which is not always quite as straightforward a process, but can be super fun. I like to think of a sheet mulch landscape as kind of like a blank canvas, which would make the plants that you're choosing and any other landscape features that you want to include your paints. The idea of a blank canvas can be kind of intimidating. Like, I can imagine walking out to my freshly sheet mulch landscape and thinking, oh wow, what do I do now? But it's also really exciting because it gives you the freedom to plant things in kind of a systemic, holistic way. So yeah, let's talk about the plants. Obviously, we're going to want something that's beautiful. We're painting a canvas, right? We're using those paints in a way that's going to look good. And as many of you are from Sonoma County, and it seems like other parts of California, you're probably no strangers to the idea of having plants in the landscape that aren't going to be particularly thirsty. We really want water-wise plants. But why stop there? A best practice is to be looking at how many benefits each plant that we're introducing to our landscape can provide for us, or how many functions they can serve. We talk at Daily Acts a lot about stacking functions. So here we have a list of some common ones, but I'm just going to walk us through the example of this beautiful pineapple guava that we have a picture of. Pineapple guava can be trained up like a tree to be like 6 to 8 feet tall. It's definitely water-wise, has low water needs. It produces an edible yield. We get these delicious guava steams. And we can also eat the flower petals, which I totally love. They're kind of like gummies. The flowers obviously also bringing an element of beauty and attracting pollinators like hummingbirds. These plants can provide habitat for birds. They could be privacy screens or create shade. I'm sure if we sat here and thought about it, we could come up with a huge number of functions that it serves, but just trying to plant that seed of having that perspective of, okay, how many functions can we stack here? So I'm going to start off giving us just a few examples of water-wise plants that I really like. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through examples, but we do have a resource on our website, on our tips and tools page. Maybe Liz or Serena can drop the link into the chat. That just it's certainly not an exhaustive list of water-wise plants because the list is humongous, but there is a pretty good number. So let's start out here in the top left. This is a ceanothus, also called California lilac. It's an evergreen native, which is a pretty good indicator that this is going to be a water-wise plant, and it absolutely is. Typically, ceanothus varieties, once they're established, aren't going to need any additional water. Of course, there are exceptions in really strong droughts and really hot spells, but typically really low maintenance. They have these beautiful blue, sometimes kind of purplish flowers that attract pollinators. They're one of the earliest blooms in the spring, so they're a great first early food source for bees. I recently learned that indigenous peoples of California, including the Pomo near where I live, use the flowers of ceanothus as a kind of soap. They have this sort of saponic quality that if you rub them between your fingers, it gets sudsy, which is really cool. You can get them in a bunch of different varieties. They can be tree-like, as in this example. There are kind of spreading ground cover varieties. I have one called the Yankee Point that's a ground cover. Big fan of ceanothus. So then moving to the right here, we have loquat, which is an attractive shade tree. Again, low water needs. And again, just like the pineapple guava, creates this delicious edible yield. People vary a lot in the way that they describe the flavor of a loquat if you've never had one. To me, it's if you had like a a Venn diagram with 3 circles, and you had cantaloupe and apricot and cherry. In that overlapping circle, you squeezed a bunch of lime right there. That's kind of the flavor of a loquat. Maybe you agree, maybe not, but I think they're delicious. The skin can be kind of tough, especially the first time you eat one, and the pits are not edible. Moving right along, we've got rosemary here. Maybe a plant more of us are familiar with. This is another with very low water needs, typically not going to need additional water once it's established. It has a nice long bloom period, and there are lots of varieties, so you can plant a few different varieties of rosemary to have this really wide blooming period for your pollinators, and have a bunch of different colors in your garden. It has culinary uses, aromatherapeutic uses. You can make like lotions and soaps and such with it. Here we have yarrow, which again is a big favorite of pollinators. Low water use, so many varieties of yarrow. We use a lot of yarrow in our daily axe gardens. There are native varieties, there are non-native varieties, different sizes, lots of different colors. It's a nutrient accumulator, and they have medicinal properties. One example being that the leaves of yarrow are a coagulant. So if you were, say, like out on a hike and you got a cut and you needed to, address your cut, you could stop the bleeding or slow it with yarrow, which is pretty cool. So the best way to know if a plant is water-wise, at least for those of us in California, is to use a tool called WooCalls, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. Right now, I just want to go over a few indicators for more like in the field, hands-on ways of knowing if a plant is water-wise. So if you're looking at the foliage of a plant and you see that its leaves are fuzzy or waxy, really small, spiky even, these are all good signs, or like a succulent. These are really good signs that your plant is water-wise. So looking at these 4, we've got a ceanothus, an elephant's ear, Oregon grape or Mahonia, and our state flower, California poppy. And based on those criteria, you could probably guess that the one of these 4 that is not water-wise is the one that is actually sitting in water, the elephant's ear. Big, smooth leaves, not a water-wise plant, whereas the other 3 would be great options for your garden. So WooCalls. WooCalls is a database. It stands for Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. It's based on evapotranspiration rates, but really all we need to worry about is this left column here, the classifications of water needs: high, moderate, low, and very low. It's important to note that WooCalls is based in California. The classifications vary by region, but they're regions of California. That doesn't mean you can't use WooCalls if you live elsewhere. It just means you might have to put a little more thought into your researching and thinking about, whether a region of California has a climate that's analogous to yours, which is another concept we'll talk about a little more. But for right now, I'm actually going to take us over to the WooCalls website, and we'll drop that link in the chat for you as well. So everybody can see website. All right, great. So this is the WooCalls homepage. If you look here on the dashboard, the second thing on the list is the user manual. I know, trying to contain your excitement. But the user manual for WooCalls is really straightforward. It's brief. I definitely recommend familiarizing yourself with it before you search the database, just so that you have a grounding in like the rationale for why they made the classifications they did, what happens when a plant kind of falls between 2 classifications, things like this. So definitely invite you to look through these tabs over here. There are also some instructions, which if my brief run through leaves you wanting for more information, this is the place to go. For now though, we're just gonna jump right into it. So this is the WooCalls database search function. First thing you're going to want to do is search for your city or one nearby. Forestville is not big enough to register on WCAL's map, so I'm going to use Petaluma, which is where Dahliax is based. We have the option to search for specific plants. If we wanted to know what the water use specifically of, say, a loquat tree is, we could just search that and it'll give us information. But for now, we're going to do more of a hypothetical. Let's say that you are planting or designing your landscape that you're transforming, and you've figured out a bunch of low water use plants that you want, that you're putting in one specific part of your garden, which we would call a hydrozone, which Serena's going to hit on later. And you need a ground cover. You're like, wow, I've got all these great low water use plants, but I need something to fill that layer. So what we can do is choose low water use and ground cover. Another thing in the user manual is it explains more about these plant types, so it can be useful for that as well. But let's see what WCALS has for us. So we've got 108 results for low water use ground covers, which is quite a lot. You can see our friend Yarrow, who we were just talking about, coming up here. Some of these entries do have pretty solid informational landing pages. Like if you click on this Yarrow, it'll take you to a description of the plant. It'll tell you things like what it's like what types of soil it likes and what kind of sun it wants. But that's definitely not the case for everything in the WCALS database, and you're probably better off looking at it as just your go-to for water needs and supplementing that information with further research elsewhere. But it's done, you see the third result here brings up an interesting point, kind of to that same effect. So we've got ice plant here. For those of us in Sonoma County, we may have sort of a knee-jerk reaction to ice plant and think, invasive. You know, the Sonoma coast has a huge swath of ice plant all around. Interestingly enough, those ice plants are actually of a totally different genus than Aptonia, but this one can also behave opportunistically or invasively. So just kind of underscoring that point that just because it's in WCALS doesn't mean it's the right choice for your garden. So yeah, got to do your research. Which actually provides me a pretty good segue back into my next concept, which some of us may be familiar with. If you're not, that's okay, because I'm about to talk about it, which is natives and non-natives. So what is a native species? A native is a species that has co-evolved or co-adapted with an ecosystem over millennia, right? So you have a plant that has grown in what we now call Forestville, for example, for thousands upon thousands of years, both in cooperation and competition with other plants, animals, insects, fungus, soil biology, climate, you know, all kinds of things, and has really proven itself to be like a survivor, which means that it's really well adapted to thriving in this ecosystem. These are plants that are going to be, they're going to need less water because they're adapted to our natural rainfall patterns. A lot of natives, just like the ceanothus we talked about earlier, don't need additional water once they're established. They're typically going to be low maintenance as well. And possibly most importantly, but at least the most exciting, is that they, over those millennia, would have developed symbiotic relationships with the other native organisms, meaning that they are mutually beneficial, whether they're different plant species that trade nutrients with each other, or say a plant that is host to a species of butterfly on which they lay eggs that hatch into caterpillars, and it's the only food they can eat. So, you know, these really important relationships to have a resilient ecosystem and a high level of biodiversity. What can interrupt that resilience is the introduction of invasives, or as I call them, opportunistic plants, which are species that are introduced to an ecosystem that they are typically not native to, though there are exceptions, in which they are outcompeting whatever organism was previously filling a given niche. And they'll typically, spread like crazy. They'll often choke out other species, which can, again, like sever those relationships of symbiosis. And you end up with less exciting, less beautiful, less resilient ecosystems. Often we don't know that a plant is invasive until it's too late. We realize it's a problem and it's really hard to get rid of. You may have noticed that, invasive plant removal workdays have been going on for decades. It's because it's really hard to get rid of them once they've established themselves. We can't really fault the plant. The best we can do is try to avoid creating more dynamics like that. Luckily, experienced gardeners and nurseries in your area will have knowledge and experience with introducing or avoiding the introduction of these kinds of plants and can advise you on that before you, do an experiment that goes awry. Does this mean that we can't use non-native plants? No, far from it. A lot of the plants that we use in our daily axe gardens are not native to California. Some of them are from almost as far away in another part of the world as you can get. The reason that they work so well in our ecosystems here is because they are from what we call analogous climates. So as you may know, in Sonoma County and in much of California, we have a Mediterranean climate. And as you can probably guess, it's called that because it's very similar to the climate of the Mediterranean region. So plants like grapes and olives and this Jerusalem sage that we have over here on the right, Phlomis fruticosa, are from the Mediterranean region, but you'll see Jerusalem sage in a really large number of gardens in Sonoma County, especially if it's a sheet mulch garden, because you know that these people are recognizing it's a water-wise plant. It attracts pollinators. It's gorgeous. And I wouldn't say it's edible, but you can pluck the little petals off the flowers, which I think look like little yellow shrimp, and suck the nectar out. And it's really delicious. Really quick, meant to mention earlier, these other two photos are just examples of native gardens. We have sticky monkey flower, or mimulus. Actually, I think maybe they reclassified that genus, but it's been called mimulus for a long time. And then artemisia, Cleveland sage, some more sticky monkey flower. Looks like we've got some penstemon hiding in there. So just to show you that a native garden can be absolutely beautiful. And even though we can't see the detail on those photos, if you're imagining that there are just tons of bees, butterflies, and birds bopping around in there, you are correct. So other climates that share, other places that share that Mediterranean climate, it's typically coastal areas, and that includes southern and southwestern, Australia, the southwestern coast of like the Cape of South Africa, and the central coast of Chile. So lots of options from all of those regions. All right. So once you've got your plants picked out, we can get back into the actual transformation aspect, right? The first thing you're going to want to ask yourself once you have done the sheet mulching process, or when you're in the midst of the sheet mulching process, is, do I want to plant my plants before or after I lay the mulch down? For the most part, this is a matter of like preference, capacity, and context. Daily X, as Liz mentioned earlier, we recommend sheet mulching and then waiting a few months if you can, which gives your lasagna landscape time to compost in place, which will allow things to settle, it'll smother out the weeds, and it'll create a really healthy soil life for your plants to get a fresh start in when they're transplanted. You can plant either after you lay the cardboard down or after you've spread the mulch, if you're going to plant on the same day that you're sheet mulching, which we definitely have done in a number of our daily axe installations. It just depends on the context. The ways that you do this based on that decision are all pretty similar. If you're going to lay your cardboard down first before the mulch, I recommend marking every single spot that you want your plants to go, and keep in mind the size that your plants will be when they're fully grown, rather than just what they are as starts. You can flag them, you can use a marker, put X's, just to get a sense of what the whole garden is going to look like. I also suggest, bringing all your plants out to their respective X's at once, but leaving them in their containers so you don't expose the roots to the soil, just for ease as you move from spot to spot. So if you're planting into the cardboard before mulch, you're going to want to use like a utility knife or scissors, even a shovel, or if you're really feeling eager, you can do your best like superhero impression punch to try to make it through that cardboard. You just need to make a hole. I'm a big fan of cutting the X. It makes it easy to create the space. And you want to, basically transplant the way you would in any other context. You make a hole, you set the root ball in, make sure that you're planting all the way into the soil. You don't want to plant into mulch. You don't want to be like part way into that compost top dressing and part the way hanging above the cardboard. You want that root crown where the roots meet the shoots to be level with the surface of the soil. You fill it back in, you lay the mulch down after, making sure you're not getting mulch piled up around the base of the plant, because as Liz was mentioning, mulch is so good at retaining water, you can actually introduce root rot or other pathogens to your plants that way. So really the only difference if you're going to mulch first and then plant is that you're going to have to clear the mulch out of the way before you punch through the cardboard. Or if you've waited, the cardboard may have broken down. It just depends how long you wait. So I wanted to uplift this little example here of intergenerational planting that's super cute. They've done a really good job. It illustrates how they've cleared the space with the mulch. It's kind of hard to see from the angle of the photo, but they've got the root crown level. Looks like they're in the process of still filling it in. You're going to cover back in with the mulch, but again, not all the way up against the base of the plant. In another adorable example on the right here, you can see there's kind of like a berm around where they've cleared the mulch and a little basin. And so they're probably going to fill in a little more with that mulch, but if you leave just a little bit of a basin around the plant, especially while you're working to get it established, you can create sort of like a ponding effect for watering your plant that can be really helpful. In the top left here, we have kind of an interesting method. This is not really aligned with the way Dahliax sheet mulches, but you could do it this way if you wanted to. I think it's probably a product of them using the recycled boxes, but it looks like they've gone ahead and planted a start and then maybe laid in compost up to where the cardboard is and done the cardboard around it. It's just harder to give it a layout that way, and you might end up with plants in places that you weren't exactly intending them to go, and also it's a little trickier to prevent the mulch from piling in on your plants. And I think you would want to go in and solve that, but you're just creating a little more work for yourself. And then the last one, just share some stoke on the youth getting excited about sheet mulching and planting water-wise gardens. I know that there's a lot that can be said about plant selection in particular. Again, I would definitely recommend checking out the resources we have on our website. We also have a resource about maintaining a water-wise garden that could be really helpful. And I gotta say it again, read that user manual before you use WooCalls. But with that, I think that's all I have for you, and I will pass it off to Serena to talk about drip irrigation, unless we have any specific questions. Again, we can also save questions for the end.
Yeah, I'm gonna say if anybody has any questions related to planting or plant selection, definitely put those in the question and answer box right now, and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. Sweet, okay, well, thanks for hanging on this long. We finally made it to irrigation, woo! So I wanted to start off with irrigation before we get started, talking about a few things that you need to do irrigation successfully. A good attitude and just a little bit of confidence. The good attitude is a personal choice, but I really hope that this webinar gives you that little bit of the other piece, the confidence you need to tackle that irrigation in your backyard. Today, we're going to discuss two different options to convert your existing irrigation: retrofitting your existing valve or retrofitting your existing sprinklers. When I say retrofit, all I really mean is that we're going to be adding a pressure regulator and a filter to your existing irrigation system so that your drip irrigation system functions properly, even though it was initially set up to be a sprinkler system. To get familiar with what either of these two options would look like, I created a really quick video to go over what these different parts are, and just an example of me and my dad's system in our backyard and an example of a conversion kit. Thanks for queuing that up, Connor.
Hi everyone, my name is Serena and I'm a programs coordinator at Daily Axe. Today I want to talk to you guys about everybody's favorite subject, irrigation. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about two different options to convert your irrigation from sprinklers to drip irrigation. One option is to convert your anti-siphon valve. The other option is to just use a pop-up sprinkler conversion kit. Let's get started. Here's the example of the first option, adding a pressure regulator and a filter to your irrigation system. As you can see here, my dad and I built the system off the existing hose bib, and it leads into two different valves. This is the anti-siphon valve, or basically a fancy word meaning it prevents water from backflowing into your system. This is the solenoid, which sends an electric signal that tells the valve to allow water in. In case you're wondering how I knew how all these pieces fit together, don't worry, they come with hints. As you can see on here on this Y filter, there's an arrow that points to which direction the water should flow through the pipe, which you can see here. Same for this little pressure regulator down here. The second option you can do to convert your sprinkler system is to use a conversion kit instead. You can purchase these conversion kits at most of your irrigation stores. The kit I'm going to show you guys today is from Wyatt Irrigation Supply in Petaluma, which they generously lent to me to show you guys today. The kit I have is right here. As you can see, it says pop-up conversion kit. It comes with, let's see here, a 30 PSI filter and a pressure regulator as well. So these are parts that you need to make sure that your drip irrigation system runs correctly. Let's see what the parts have in this kit. So the parts that are included are actually really simple to use. As you can see, this part here is called your riser. It's got a little part at the bottom where you can screw it into where your sprinkler was before, and it rises up with two different options right here. You can either twist on one of these, which would be for one drip line, or it actually has the option to do two of them if you needed two lines to come out of this riser. There's also an option with just a cap, if you just needed one line. But as you can see, this would be a really simple system to use. It does come with a pressure regulator and a filter, so your system would run great, and it's easy to use.
Thank you, Connor. Did I say it was easy to use? So now that you've all gotten a better look at these pieces and how they fit together, let's take a closer look at our two suggested options for converting your irrigation and how you'd actually do these conversions. So starting with option one, as you can see, the valve here has been retrofitted with a Y filter and a preset pressure regulator. Some distance away from the valve, and likely under a little bit of hardscape, you can see a chosen sprinkler has been converted to drip. Let's talk about the steps it would take to get to this final product. First, you need to flag a central sprinkler. Ideally, you're going to be doing this before you sheet mulch, because I can tell you from personal experience, it's really hard to find those sprinklers once you've done your sheet mulching. Think of the central sprinkler as the chosen one. This is going to be the sprinkler that we're going to attach our drip irrigation to. So we want it to be in a convenient location so that we can irrigate all the plants we need to with it. Once you've established your chosen sprinkler, you're going to want to cap off all of your other sprinklers. This is one of two ways I'm going to show you today that you can cap off your sprinklers, with a Schedule 40 PVC cap. I will discuss the second option a little bit later for capping your sprinklers. Now that all the sprinklers have been capped off, we can convert the chosen sprinkler. This part is being done ideally before sheet mulching, like I said before. Whether or not you convert this using a compression elbow or T just depends on if you want to run a single line from the valve or set up more of a grid, to which you'd want to consider using a T instead. Make sure to cover either the elbow or the T holes with tape before you sheet mulch so that you don't get a bunch of dirt inside of the tubing. And also make sure you leave a flag so that you know where you're gonna set up your drip before you start your sheet mulching so you don't accidentally cover it up with that sheet mulch. Once you've capped off your sprinklers and converted that chosen one, this is your final product. Keep in mind you would need to do this process for each valve or hydrozone that you want to irrigate with. I'll talk a little bit about hydrozones in just a minute. This is a great option, by the way, that last option is a great option, by the way, if your existing irrigation is broken or not functioning. So like if you don't have a valve that's currently working in your backyard and you don't know what's going on with it and it's really, really old and it's like all cracked from the sun, this option is great because it does require that you cut into that PVC and either replace the valve or retrofit the valve with those new things, which you'd have to cut into anyways. Thanks, Connor. Now let's talk about the second option, which is retrofitting that sprinkler. I gave this option a gold star because this is the option that Daily Axe would use at our home site transformations if you had a valve that was already working. This is a great option, like I said, if your existing irrigation is already functioning just fine, or if you have a relatively new valve and you just really don't feel comfortable cutting in and adding those other retrofits to the valve directly. As you can see in this image, instead of having the filter and pressure regulator attached to the valve, here it's going to actually attach to the chosen sprinkler. Yes, you heard that right. There are filters and pressure regulators made to attach before the drip line to make your life even easier. It's awesome, right? I'm going to come back to this image, but first let's talk about the steps you need to do this conversion. Just like the first option, you're going to want to flag that chosen sprinkler that you'll be using to attach your drip line to. Then you're going to want to cap off all of your other sprinklers. Here, I wanted to show you another way that you can cap your sprinklers. Instead of stubbing them up above the ground, you can actually dig down, twist your sprinkler out, and twist a nice little plug right in. This is a much easier option than using the stub up method that I mentioned before. However, if for any reason, say like you did some sort of backyard transformation and you needed to have your point of connection from your irrigation in a different location, this would make it really difficult because it's all the way down under the ground, you've covered it up, you've long forgotten where that sprinkler is, you're probably not going to be able to find it again. Something to keep in mind. Now for the conversion. On the chosen sprinkler, this time you're going to need a Schedule 80 nipple that you twist into where the sprinkler was to bring you up to ground level. This would be where you'd attach your elbow, transition nipple, and then the filter and pressure regulator. This is an option for if you wanted to buy all those pieces separately or kind of make your own system. But like I said in the video, a lot of irrigation stores have these kits available with all these pieces you need to make this transition. So don't worry too much about that. For this setup especially, you'd want to place a tiny circular plastic utility box over all of these pieces because the filter and pressure regulator really can't function properly if they're surrounded by dirt or if dirt gets into that system. Last but not least, I wanted to include this third bonus option that doesn't involve converting sprinklers. Instead, you attach your drip line immediately after your valve setup. As you can see in this option, the compression L or T with a hose swivel is attached directly after the pressure regulator, which then allows you to convert directly to drip. This is a great option if you have an existing sprinkler system that's broken, if you don't have an existing system in your backyard and you're building one out, or if your valves are located close to the irrigated area and you don't have to maneuver around any sort of hardscape. Now that we've discussed 3 options to convert your irrigation, I've provided 3 shopping lists, so to say, for you to use for your conversion once you've figured out which option is best suited to your garden. I'm not going to read all over these lists, but here's one for option 1. We have one for option 2 and one for option 3. We will send you these PowerPoint slides afterwards, by the way. I did want to point out though, for options 1 and options 3, if you are retrofitting your valve and or stubbing up your sprinklers, basically anything that you're going to use Schedule 40 PVC for, which is that hard plastic piping, you're going to need some extra parts, like extra PVC, some couplers, and some glue, otherwise known as plastic welding, and definitely some pipe cutters. Don't let these things scare you though, I promise it's all totally doable. Now that we've discussed parts that you need, there's a bunch of questions that might come up for you. Like the big question now is how should you set up your drip irrigation? Should you get blank line and point source emitters or use drip line that comes with emitters built in? How many valves do you need? How long could you even run your drip line for? I mean, the answers to all of these questions, of course, is really it depends. But let's talk about the different options we have. First, let's talk about how many valves you need. I know we just got done talking about converting your valves, but we didn't really talk about how many. When Connor was talking about plants earlier, he introduced you to WUCOLs. In WUCOLs, you were able to see the water requirements for your desired plants. You're going to need that information to determine how many valves you're going to want to have set up. Each valve is responsible for watering one area. For this reason, we use the terms valve and hydrozone really interchangeably. Ideally, your hydrozone consists of one water requirement, low or medium, because I know you wouldn't use a high water use plant in your landscape, of course. Hydrozones can also be used to differentiate watering schedules. For example, you might want to water your low water use plants 3 times a week with a small amount of water, but your trees 2 times a week with a really large amount of water. For this reason, you'd want to have your trees and your low water use plants on 2 different hydrozones, or 2 different valves. In this example, there are 3 hydrozones depicted. The symbols below show what that look like hourglasses are the typical symbols that are used for valves. Now imagine, each one of these valves is going to have different lines coming out of it, and each one of these lines needs to go to a specific type of plant with a water requirement. So your low water line needs to go to only those low water plants, and your moderate line needs to go to only those moderate use plants, and those tree lines need to get to all 3 of your trees. As you can imagine, if you have a lot of different type of water requirement plants interspersed throughout your landscape, it's going to get really hard to set up that irrigation really fast. For this reason, I definitely recommend setting up your planting plan with irrigation in mind. It'll save you a lot of hardship later. With that in mind, if you want to learn more about water scheduling and you don't really know how to set that up, we do have a webinar coming up in July with an irrigation expert, so definitely stay tuned for that. Now let's talk about the drip lines themselves. You have 2 options, drip that comes with emitters or drip that you can add your own emitters to. In this slide, you can see drip line with emitters, otherwise known as inline drip. This also gets the gold star because at Daily Acts, we've come to love this line. Why? Because it's considerably lower maintenance. The emitters are built in, so there's no chance of like a child or a dog or somebody walking over the line and popping off that emitter and creating a mini geyser. Inline drip comes with different flow and emitter spacing options. It only comes in 1/2-inch sizing, so you don't have to make a choice there. And we typically use 12-inch spacing with 0.4 gallon per hour or 0.6 gallon per hour emitters. If you use this line, make sure not to exceed 200 feet of line per valve. Once you exceed 200 feet, the line won't function properly. Your emitters won't work right. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Your second option is to get blank line, which comes in 1/2-inch or 3/4 inch, and add your own point source emitters. An example of when you'd want to consider doing this is if you need to run your drip line more than 200 feet on one valve in your landscape area, in which case you'd want to use 3/4 inch line, which doesn't come in inline options anyways. As you can see in the photo, the blank line has been punched and attaches a 1/4 inch tubing or spaghetti tubing with an emitter attached to it. If you decide to use blank line and add your own point source emitters, make sure to consider this rule. For 1/2-inch drip line, you can't exceed 200 feet or 200 gallons per hour per hydrozone or per valve. And for 3/4 inch drip line, you cannot exceed 480 feet or 480 gallons per hour per hydrozone. Now you might be wondering, how do you know if you're breaking the rules or not? You simply add up your flow controls, otherwise known as your emitters. Let's do a quick calculation as an example. So here in this example, I'm showing you that I decided to use 1/2-inch blank tubing and I added my own 1/2 gallon per hour emitters. I need to lay out 200 feet of tubing and I use 200 emitters. So about an emitter every foot, but it doesn't have to be exact. What is the gallons per hour total? So as you can see, I have 0.5 gallons per hour per emitter, and I have 200 emitters total on that 200 feet of line, which means I have a total flow of 100 gallons per hour, which is well below my limit. I could definitely add more emitters. In this second example, I decided to use 1/2-inch blank tubing and I added my own 1 gallon per hour emitters. I needed to lay out 200 feet of tubing and I used 200 emitters. What's the gallons per hour? This time I have 1 gallon per hour per each emitter, and I have 200 emitters in that 200 feet of line, and I've reached my 200 gallon per hour limit. Now I put it in red here, but I could technically still run this and it'd be fine. However, if I'm laying it out and I decided I really needed more emitters on that line, I would definitely want to use 3/4 inch line instead of 1/2-inch line. Now that we've discussed some design considerations, here's the final parts you're going to need to complete your system. You'll need drip line, of course, and additional emitters, and a punch if you decide to go the point source route. You'll need elbows and tees to direct your line around the garden. Make sure to pay attention to the size so that it matches your drip line. I put a star next to the ones with the spinny things on it because those are called spin locks, and we love those at Daily Axe because they're also very child, dog, walk proof. Also, you're going to need stakes to hold down your drip line that punch right through your cardboard from sheet mulching, figure eights to cap off the ends of your drip lines, some threading tape for any pieces that twist together, and mulch to cover those lines. We really, really like to emphasize this part. These drip lines are not meant to be exposed to the sun and will degrade a lot faster if they are. So you definitely want to make sure you have some mulch left over to cover up those lines. Plus, it just looks more aesthetically pleasing. That's all I've got for you today. Irrigation can take a lot of patience, but the good news is there's so many resources and people who are here to help you along the way. You've got this.
Thanks, Serena. So we've only got about 10 minutes till 8. I have just like 2 quick things to go over, and then we're gonna get into the question and answer. And I'm sure Liz and Serena would agree, if we have more questions and we hit 8 o'clock, we're happy to stay on and answer those questions for you. And if you have to run, you're free to email us any questions that you have. And just a reminder, we're gonna send you this recording in PowerPoint and additional resources. So we all have that to look forward to. So real quick, I would love to talk to y'all just briefly about the Be the Change campaign that we're running. So this is the action campaign that we started, about 5 weeks ago now. At Daily Axe, if you're familiar with us, you know that we believe that the cumulative power of our daily actions can truly change the world. And so the Be the Change campaign aims to inspire people to take actions that transform their lives to match the vision for the world that they hold in their hearts. And we're going to be doing this with 4 different focal areas. So we have grow a garden, build community, save resources, and practice self-care. The way the campaign works is we have lots of actions under these categories that you can pledge to take. If you follow through with what we talked about in this webinar tonight, you'll have knocked out a bunch of the actions, both in the grow a garden category and the save resources. Look at you. We're going to be rolling out a lot of our save resources content starting next week. So basically on our part, we're going to be supporting your actions by putting out, as we have been, written resources, how-to videos, webinars like this one, but also more in-depth with experts. We've already done one on gray water and one on rainwater that are available to really guide you through these processes. And the idea is that we're tracking these actions so that we can share this narrative that our communities aren't just ready for transformative change, we're already making it happen on the ground. So I could talk about it for a long time, but I'll just say, I encourage you to check out the link here, dailyaxe.org/be-the-change for more information and also to register so you can join us and be the change that you want to see in the world. A quick shout out. None of this would be possible without our amazing sponsors. Big shout out to them. And also, again, just wanted to express some gratitude to the Town of Windsor for making this event possible. And with that, we are, just a last reminder. Again, if you have questions, feedback, you just want to show Daily Axe some love, whatever it is, you can email me at connor@dailyaxe.org. I can pass along your gratitude to Liz and Serena as well. And with that, I think we will open it up to the Q&A. So again, you can enter your questions in that question and answer box, and we will do our best to answer them.
Thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Believe it or not, it looks like we don't have any questions at this time. We'll wait it out.
Yeah.
People are percolating.
Looks like maybe some stuff's going on in the chat.
We have somebody, Nadia writes, my location is underwater in winter. How to build raised mounds. Underwater in winter, how to build raised mounds. You know, I could mention hugelkultur. If you had any sort of leftover logs, or you can, again, kind of from a wood chipping company, they typically have logs laying about. basically dig a hole, put those logs in there, put some compost or soil on top of it, dirt, and then plant right into that. That might be a solution to help retain the shape of your mound so that you can actually plant into it, and it would also allow for you to have a raised space so that the roots of your plants are not submerged year round. And that's hugelkultur. I think it's German for like raised bed. It's a really great opportunity to reuse materials.
And we have I believe we have a resource about hugelkultur on our tips and tools page as well. Another option, which this is kind of a lengthy topic, but I'll just mention, you probably could use some earthworks methods to divert some of that water. I don't know the specifics of why your site is underwater, but techniques like digging swales can really go a long way. So that might be something worth looking into.
Yeah, we have another person writing. Juliana mentions that they have water pooling in areas in their yard as well, and wondering if you could create a seasonal water feature. Definitely, just expanding on what Connor's mentioning, is that there are so many ways to create intentional topography on your site to slow, spread, and sink that water, whether you're doing swales and you're kind of gearing the water and sending it to one place, and then you ultimately have an overflow called a rain garden, but essentially it's methods where you work with your landscape and you try and divert that water elsewhere. But it certainly is dependent on where you're at and what are the conditions as to why you are flooding, because there are areas where it's inevitable that you're going to flood, and you just have to prepare for that accordingly, unfortunately.
And for anyone who hasn't heard of swales before, it's basically just a berm and a basin. So it's a ditch. In its simplest form, it's a ditch that you dig on contour of your land, and you use the earth that you removed from the ditch part to create a berm so that water channels through that way and it goes where you want it to.
We have Molly saying that they've learned about sheet mulching when you lay cardboard compost and mulch, and they're asking what the difference is. And to be perfectly honest, I actually don't have a good answer to this question. I've heard that before, as far as the processes, whether you do compost first or cardboard first. The only thing that comes to mind for me is that once you're planting into that zone, so in my opinion, you're putting your compost, your cardboard, and then your mulch. That way, once you are digging into everything, the very last layer that those roots are hitting is the compost, is the soil. It allows them to go deeper and spread and become bigger. So that would be my own, just a first thought, what would make the main difference there. If you're planting, if you have cardboard, compost, and then mulch, when you plant into that compost, I think very seldomly the plants are going to be able to actually grow through the cardboard unless they had about a year and that cardboard is already in more of the decomposition stage. That would be really the main thing that comes to mind, which is why we do compost, cardboard, then mulch. So we have Lorenzo writing, what would be your recommendation for working around major large tree roots? The roots are currently semi-exposed in the lawn. I plan to remove. Working around. So to me that reads, we're assuming that it's not an existing tree, you just have tree roots there. I guess, yeah, if you could remove them and then sheet mulch over, that's fantastic, as long as you're not, as long as the intention is not to keep that tree or those roots alive. Ideally, otherwise, over time, they are going to decompose, but tree roots last quite some time. I'm not sure if anybody else has any other suggestions for that.
I would just say, in the meantime, if you were looking to sheet mulch in the meantime before you had them removed, I would just treat it like, as Liz was talking about, with the base of a tree or a power box, and just mulch around them. If that were the case that you were waiting.
Fantastic. We have somebody writing for their small front lawn, they're looking forward to getting rid of, but it does slope downwards towards the sidewalk. So what techniques would we suggest to accommodate the slope needed to lay the cardboard, since the yard is already sloped?
I'm wondering if this is a question about the edging.
Yeah, so the edging is certainly going to be an opportunity. So basically with that edge, you've created a lower point in your landscape. So ideally, when you're laying everything down, in an instance where maybe you have a heavy rain and it might push some of that mulch down, ideally you have this lower edge that stops everything before it goes into the storm drain. We did recently work at a site at the Strauss Family Creamery headquarters where they had some seriously sloped landscape. And what we ended up doing, we sheet mulched just as normal. We probably maybe created a wider edge at the very end of the slope, but we did everything exactly the same. The one thing that we really did to try and combat any sort of runoff during stormy weather would be that we actually laid, what do they call, wattles, I believe is the name. So it's, you might have seen them like alongside a highway or something near a storm drain. It's basically kind of this mesh material, and there's rice straw or hay or something embedded in this long kind of spaghetti-like wattle. And we put that at the very edge of our landscape in case, in the instance of a heavy rainstorm, if anything were to wash out, it would be captured by that swaddle or by that wattle and not going into the storm drain. So for a sloped area, sheet mulching will work. It will stay on site, but just know that you have to have those added barriers just as a precautionary measure. Another solution would be, and this is very dependent on your site, what you have, but I would suggest planting large plants that will grow fast and spread. That way it will help kind of actually stabilize that edge and keep things on your site. So that would be probably maybe some of the things that come to mind with that one.
The only other thing I could think of with specifically the cardboard is if you're using rolls, roll in the direction of the slope so that you don't have to worry about the cardboard itself shifting downhill.
Awesome. Any last questions out there? I hope that you all were able to learn something new. And as Connor mentioned, please always feel free to reach out. Our website is a spring of information and knowledge and resources. And we are more than happy to connect with you offline outside of the webinar and hopefully get your questions answered. So somebody writes, can you throw coffee grounds into a sheet mulched yard? Yeah, why not? Maybe not. I see some panelists questioning that. One thing with coffee grounds is they're going to be pretty acidic. They're going to add a lot of acidity to your soil. So you're going to want to know what condition your soil is in. And so I would say if you're throwing it all into one place, probably certain plants are not going to do well in that highly acidic section of your lawn. But you know what? Coffee grounds are great for compost. So I would recommend if you put that in your worm bin or your composting system so that it can help reduce those rich acidic nutrients. I appreciate all the kind words from people whenever we're logging off. It's really nice. I'm glad that this has been a great resource for a lot of you. Thank you.
Okay, guys. Well, I guess if there's no more questions, we are going to log off for the night. Keep an eye on your inboxes because you will be receiving a follow-up email with those resources. So everybody have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, thank you all. Have a great evening.
Good night. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Need a goodbye song.
We do need a goodbye.
Farewell to you, my friends. Okay, bye, everybody.
Good night.
Night.